Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. We are welcoming you to the presentation of the Q4 2022 report on market issues and performance. This event is being recorded. That recording will be available on the CAISO's website. We ask that you please do not quote the presentation recording exactly without explicit permission from the CAISO. With that, I will give another few minutes for people to join. But I'll just start out with, I think I start most of the report presentations out this way with a really profound sense of gratitude for the work, the analysis that goes into all of the reporting that we do. There's a lot of material available on the Department of Market Monitoring website. A link to that website is available at the bottom of the slide. And I highly recommend, if you have a question, if you're interested in how the market is functioning, we may have a report on it, and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. A link to the report that is the subject of this discussion is also on the bottom of the slide in front of you. Okay. We will stop periodically for questions. I scheduled this call for longer than the typical hour in response to a set of requests from participants in past calls who asked that we give a little bit longer time to allow for more questions. So please do feel free to stop me along the way and do ask questions. If you have if you've logged into the WebEx discussion today, you can ask the question by raising your hand, and then you will be unmuted. If you have called in to the discussion today, please press #2 on your phone to be unmuted. Thank you to Michelle, who is our operator today, who is going to be facilitating all of the questions. So thank you, Michelle. And with that, I will get started on the Q4 2022 report on market issues and performance. I can get my screen to that. There we go. Highlights of Q4. The biggest highlight, and this will be immediately apparent when you see the next set of slides, is the dramatic increase in natural gas prices. These natural gas price increases raised wholesale electricity prices, not only in California, but in fact across the WEIM market footprint. The gas price increases were particularly high in December. You'll find throughout the report that we do a lot of comparing between both between the gas price increases both in Q4 and December, and the other prices in the market, explaining what's going on. So higher prices in CAISO and WEIM compared to 2021. Higher natural gas prices really across the board in the WEIM market footprint. Congestion increases, and you'll see those increases then filtering through to some of the other congestion-related costs. High real-time imbalance offset costs, we'll discuss those, and then relatively high bid cost recovery. Those are the highlights. Let's get started with our higher natural gas prices. And this chart shows monthly average natural gas prices at several gas hubs. Henry Hub in the dark blue is the national index. We also included PG&E Citygate in Northern California, SoCal Citygate in Southern California, El Paso Permian in the Southwest, Northwest Sumas in the north, ACO farther in the north, and then the Rocky Mountain Hub. You'll see price increases between 2021 Q4 averages and 2022 in each of these hub prices. ACO only a cent. Henry Hub also fairly moderate, whereas in California, PG&E Citygate, SoCal Citygate, as well as in Northwest Sumas, gas prices more than doubled. In fact, quarter on quarter, the SoCal Citygate is up about 150%. PG&E Citygate's up about 140%. A couple of notes I want to make on this slide. First is that the PG&E Citygate price has often been relatively stable. So you can see that going back through 2019, but even earlier. That, I believe, had to do with the use of gas in storage to moderate dramatic price changes. That was not the case in November and starting in December, and those high gas prices did continue through January and to a lesser degree, and then in February again to a lesser degree. The other note I'll make on this while we're on the monthly page is that you can see a dramatic gas price spike in February of 2021. That occurred during the Winter Storm Uri event, when it was a national event. What's interesting in the difference between the 2021 event and the 2022 event in December is that the 2021 was a short period of time with very high prices. What we saw in 2022, on my next slide here, was an extended elevation of gas prices above the national Henry Hub index. So here we're showing daily hub prices at the same hubs as in the last chart, with Henry Hub as the national index and SoCal Citygate, PG&E Citygate bolded to highlight the difference there. And you can see that the dramatic increase started about the 8th and then extended out through the end of January. I'll just highlight while I'm here that the gas prices really peaked in late December, and we have some charts later that will reference this gas price. So we are using the peak of the gas prices to highlight the way that these higher natural gas prices really do filter through into electricity prices. What were those electricity prices? That's on this chart. This chart shows load-weighted CAISO prices. So across the CAISO balancing, California ISO balancing area, in the day-ahead market in blue, 15-minute market in yellow, and the 5-minute market in green. This one goes back to 2020. You can see here the price goes up dramatically in December, even more dramatically than it did in September, when the CAISO saw an extended heat wave with the historically high peak demand. Doing some of those comparisons, we see the Q4 average cost for day ahead at 140 is 126% higher than it was in Q4 2021. And again, that's a little bit lower than the gas price increase. 15-minute market prices were $59 last Q4, and now they're up to $136 per megawatt hour, and that again is about 131% increase. So slightly lower increases than overall in the gas price index. Another way of showing almost the same information, same set of prices. This chart combines those with the SoCal Citygate gas price. We could have selected any of the other hubs, but this one I think is useful. If we start with the 2021 event in February, you can see that there was a gas price spike that did not result in higher electricity prices in average. We look at the summer 2022 event in August and September. You can see that the gas prices, the correlation between the gas prices is showing that those electricity prices, in fact, rose more than the gas prices might indicate. This chart is set up purposely to have the energy prices on the left-hand axis be 10 times the gas prices on the right-hand axis. So that's about a 10,000 heat rate. We look at December and January, which I'm showing here. What we see is that the gas price index at a 10,000 heat rate would have predicted about a $300 price. And in fact, our average prices were somewhat lower. Again, if there are questions, please feel free to interrupt. You can press #2 if you're calling in only, or raise your hand. These charts show bids, and this is part of the mechanism by which those higher gas prices result in higher wholesale electricity prices. The chart on the left is showing the bid stack for 1 day and 1 hour. This is hour ending 19, I believe, for December 22nd, 2021. So our peak net load hour on the day that had the very highest gas price, December 22nd, 2022 in red, and on the same day, same hour, was also a weekday, so similar circumstances in some ways, the year prior when gas prices were lower. You see there's a part of the supply curve that is similar, but what we see is that most of the supply curve is substantially higher with the higher gas prices. One other thing I'll note is that there's also less supply bid into the market on December 22nd, 2022. The chart on the right just takes out the subset of the supply curves that is coming from gas resource bids. So again, this is day-ahead market. So these are bids into the CAISO balancing area day-ahead market. What you can see here is that the quantity for gas resource bids is about the same year on year, but what you see is from almost the entire span of that supply, we see higher bids, which would reflect those higher marginal costs. Taking a look at the same supply curve for the same hour, so that's hour ending 18, 6 p.m. And it's breaking that supply down by source type. The blue, the sort of aqua blue color, is showing default generation of multiple fuel types. You'll see there's a section on the bottom that is coming from self-schedule, which can come from multiple resources, but for example, a solar resource with a price-taking resource. The brown is showing import bids, and the red is showing bids from gas resources. The purple is showing bids from standalone registered storage resources. What we see here is that the bids of the gas resources are high, and then at the very top of the supply curve, there's a substantial amount of bids that are coming from what we've labeled virtual supply, and those are financial bids that are settled at the difference between the day-ahead and 15-minute market average price. Same definitions for the chart on the right. That's for the same hour in the previous year when, as a reminder, gas prices were much lower. You can see there that not only are the gas bids lower, but so are some of the other bids in the market. And there were fewer bids from storage resources, for example, and resources that have opportunity costs, which are based either directly on gas prices or on electricity prices at a different point in time, for example, would also see higher marginal costs and would be expected to bid higher, as they appear to have done. The average price increases are being driven by, I believe, a record frequency of high prices. This chart separates the frequency by month, and in the day-ahead market on the left-hand side, the 15-minute market in the middle panel, and the 5-minute market on the right-hand side. In December, more than 50% of the day-ahead prices were above $250 per megawatt hour. Just to go back, $250 per megawatt hour would be intersecting the supply curve relatively low on this particular day. 250 would have been at a substantially higher quantity in the year before. So 50% of prices at that level indicates that the supply bids were substantially higher throughout the month, which is in fact what we see. Those high frequencies also occur in the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. With that, I'll stop for a second to see if there are any questions.
Just as a reminder, you can use the raise hand feature to enter the question queue, or if you are on the phone only, you can press #2 to raise your hand and ask a question. And so far, I see no questions in the queue.
All right. This chart looks at day-ahead California ISO prices compared to prices at two of the major electricity hubs in the western U.S., Mid-C and Palo Verde, Mid-Columbia. We are comparing the peak packages at Mid-Columbia and Palo Verde to the average CAISO day-ahead energy price, and doing that on a daily basis for the peak days. What you can see there is that not only were CAISO prices high, but so were the Mid-Columbia and Palo Verde prices. Those index prices are used as benchmarks to measure the opportunity cost for a lot of supply that's external to the CAISO boundary. One other note on this is it's become fairly unusual to see higher CAISO prices than Mid-Columbia and Palo Verde. Typically, the California ISO day-ahead price is lower than either one or the other in recent days. But we did have intervals where we did have higher California ISO prices. These index prices, as well as the California ISO, do reflect the higher gas prices that were associated with higher demand in some of the areas external to the ISO, as well as a change in the use of gas storage to moderate gas price increases. There's any interest in the more interest in the gas prices and how they affect electricity prices. I'd recommend the California Public Utilities Commission held an all-day session, solicited presentations from many in the industry, and those presentations, and I believe a recording is available on the California PUC's website. That was held on February 7th and was an en banc hearing on the gas price increases and the effect of the gas price increases on electricity prices. I recommend it. This slide takes a look at our imports and exports. It compares average hourly values quarter to quarter, year to year. So the first panel on the left is comparing average hourly values for Q1 of 2021 to Q1 of 2022. The panel on the right is the one that I will discuss today, compares Q4 imports and exports and net interchange with the average hourly values for 2021. Imports in the day-ahead market are shown in blue above the axis, in the day-ahead market. Yellow is the 15-minute market, and exports are shown below the axis. The difference between the 15-minute market import and the 15-minute market export is shown as the net interchange. And then we add in the effect of the Western Energy Imbalance market as the solid gray line. As consistently for the other quarters, looking Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4, and we saw an increase in exports from the California ISO. This is market exports. This is not including any of the WEIM. But in Q4, we have lower exports than we do in Q3 and typically in Q2. The dramatic difference, and this wasn't true comparing every quarter earlier, but the dramatic difference in Q4 is the reduction in imports. That reduction in imports was true in both the day-ahead and 15-minute market. Although there are incremental offers of import generation available in the real-time 15-minute market. On net, there were lower levels of net imports in each hour of the quarter. This chart compares sources generation in the California ISO balancing area by source, and it's comparing average hourly values for Q4 2022 to Q4 2021. The red is showing our net imports. And what you see there is similar to the previous chart. It's just a different way of showing it, is that dramatic reduction in import capacity. That import capacity was replaced for the most part with natural gas, shown in the light blue, as well as batteries, shown in the peach, I don't know what to call that color, peach color, below the blue, and additional solar in the midday period. Much of the capacity listed as other is in fact hybrid. A lot of that is combined solar and battery capacity in the orange. Aren't any changes, any questions on that? I will move on and talk about congestion. It's related. This is a chart showing congestion on our major interties in the day-ahead market, sort of comparing, year on year, the congestion rent on the interties. We don't always present this chart, but we typically include it in all of our reports. So if you're interested in going back even farther, you can. As has historically been the case, import congestion tends to occur on a few of the major interties, particularly Malin and shown here in green and blue. What we saw in Q4 were lower levels of import congestion. And when we did see import congestion, that congestion was on Palo Verde in yellow and Malin. So Palo Verde coming in from the southwest, and Malin coming in from the north. Consistent with seeing lower levels of imports or lower levels of congestion. Talk a little bit about the EIM. I always like to have maps. I have a weakness for maps. So this is a map of the WEIM. I would hope, and I think it does, show the 3 new members that will be joining. 3 new members that will be joining soon in early April. Planned implementation for El Paso Electric, Avangrid Renewables, and the Western Area Power Authority Desert Southwest. We had 4 new members joining in 2022, and with that expansion, we've seen an expansion in the resource, the generation that is bid into the WEIM market, as well as an expansion in the transmission that is offered in the WEIM market. We have seen a set of pricing patterns that are consistent in the Q4, but have been consistent for years in the WEIM, and those are typically lower prices in the Northwest. Northwest area tends to be separated by congestion from the rest of the system, and we tend to see higher prices in the California areas due to both congestion and California state's greenhouse gas cap and trade program and provisions in the market that allow those greenhouse gas prices to be deemed delivered to the state of California to serve California load. These are some of my favorite charts. These are ways of showing average exports. The chart on the left is showing average midday exports. Chart on the right is showing averages for the net load peak hour. These are based on the average use of the transmission rather than the average transmission capacity. So the total sum here for California ISO, for example, bank is easier. For bank would be the average import, in this case, for the balancing area of Northern California. There may be additional transfer capacity available. These are showing average transfers, not average congested transfers or average offers of transmission into the market. You look at the midday period, and I'll start with California ISO because they have some of the largest transfers. What we see is a net export, and we see in the export portion in the inner ring here highlighted where there's an import, there's a blank value in that inner ring. The color associated with the flow is based on the source of that transfer. So in this case, California ISO in the middle of the day is transferring a significant amount of capacity to the balancing area of Northern California. This is based on averages over the quarter, and we exclude average transfers less than 50 megawatts. we see average transfers out of other areas as well, particularly the desert Southwest. And we tend to see imports in this quarter into the Pacific Northwest. We'll highlight Powerex, BC Hydro, importing a substantial amount of generation in those midday hours from California ISO, some of which may be, wheeled in from Nevada, for example, which is importing here into CAISO, but then CAISO is exporting out. Pattern is dramatically different in the peak net load hours. Here, about half of the transfers are going into California. So Turlock, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, CAISO, and the balancing area of Northern California, as opposed to the midday hours when they're a little bit less than half. See imports into California coming from the desert Southwest in the WEIM, the mountain Northwest, and the Pacific Northwest. I love that these charts, I think, do a good job of summarizing typical patterns. They take a little while to decode. If you are interested in the flows into or out of a particular balancing area in the WEIM, our report contains an appendix. That appendix includes average transfers, WEIM transfers into and out of each area in the 15-minute market, as I'm showing here, as well as the 5-minute market. So if you're interested in your particular area, you can find those average values in the appendix.
Amelia, I believe there's a question in the queue.
All right, I'd be happy to take a question.
Yeah, hey, Amelia, this is Chris Devin with CES. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
Very good. Thank you for the presentation. Just had a question on the WEIM pricing slide that you had. I think it was slide 14 with the bullets on there talking about peak prices in California exceeding other areas due to GHG and congestion, and the Northwest regularly lower. Would you expect, maybe this is a little bit of a question about your expectations with the addition of the GHG pricing in Washington State. Would you expect that would drive those prices to become a little bit closer together or increase prices in the Northwest, even though there's still some limited transfer capability?
It may. We're still evaluating what that impact will be. I believe Washington State held its first auction in late February, so we have yet to see a substantial impact of the Washington State program or the tariff changes that the ISO made in pricing in the market. But yeah, generically, I would expect that if in Washington State there were a cap and trade program that was in the market similar to the way that California is in the market, you would expect to see higher prices inside Washington State relative to outside because of the GHG, as you do in California. And how those compare, we'd have to see. I think, as you are no doubt very, very aware, there's a lot of pooled hydro with significant storage in the Northwest. So a little bit different resource mix there. We shall see. We'll show you average prices here. And
Thank you for that, Amelia. I had one more question before you get into that on the import slide a little bit earlier on. I think it was slide 12. Just real quickly, I was hoping to get your take on this trend of reduced imports. It's pretty drastic here. Showing like 3,000, 4,000 megawatts lower than prior years. So do you think that's driven more by just the natural dynamics of the supply mix and pricing in other areas, or more so, potentially related to this is the increased use of EIM transfers and lack of having to pay for the transmission piece of it? Is that, do you have a sense of maybe, I think probably both things are driving that to some extent, but just wanted to see if you had any reaction to that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I'll add a third thing to the mix, which is there was a change in the CPUC's requirements for RA imports, which requires those RA is resource adequacy, requires those imports being shown to meet resource adequacy requirements in the state of California to bid in at or below zero, essentially to ensure that they would be dispatched. That has, over the years, and we have a nice chart for this in the quarterly that I didn't put in the slide deck today. That has shown year over year in lower quantities of import bids. So that's one factor. That's not a particularly, from memory, the amount of import RA in December, sort of in the Q4, is very, very low, somewhere between 300 and 500 megawatts, something like that. I think the biggest factor is that the supply and demand conditions outside of the CAISO were raising the marginal cost, raising really the opportunity cost of a lot of the resources outside of the CAISO. And that's why we saw such substantially lower imports.
Very good. Thank you so much for that, Amelia. I think that was helpful. I was just curious as to, a little bit more color there on those couple items. So thank you for your time. Sure.
I'll add one fourth thing to consider, particularly for the Northwest, is despite, and you can probably hear it in the background, despite the deluge of water that California has gotten in the last month or so, there's been relatively little rainfall, little precipitation in the Northwest, and that does raise the opportunity cost of using some of that hydro that is in storage there. Other thing, prices. The question that Chris had was about the sort of stylistic, but I find that it's a simplification that kind of highlights the exceptions. And it's a useful framework for looking at prices in so many areas at once. This chart shows average 15-minute prices for each area in the WEIL and for the major DLAPs in CAISO by price component. So the blue is the system energy price. Yellow, there, the orange yellow, is congestion within a WEIM BAA. That includes California ISO. So historically, with this chart, we've called that congestion within CAISO because almost all of the congestion was within CAISO. that was not true in this quarter, and so we updated our labeling on the chart. Just so you all have something to look forward to in the annual report when we get to publishing that, when the settlement data comes in, we will separate out congestion within CAISO from congestion within non-CAISO WEIM BAs. That's the yellow. Red is showing the impact of congestion on WEIM transfer limits, and black is showing the transmission loss component. The green shows the GHG, that's the California greenhouse gas component, and the black line is the sum of the average price. Couple notes here. These are rank ordered. You'll see that the California areas on average have the higher prices. All of the other prices have the GHG, or are lower because in part of the GHG shown in green below the 0. Otherwise, I'll note here the really high impact of congestion on WEIM transfers here. I'll highlight for SRP, Salt River, in red, and for the internal congestion for PNM in yellow. That was actually congestion outside of CAISO. One note on the GHG component is that part of the price is paid back to entities outside of California to help them meet their GHG compliance obligations. Likewise, congestion on WEIM transfer limits, the congestion rent is paid back to the entity that put that transmission into the market in the first place. I see a question pop up on the chat. If you could unmute and ask the question, I can do a better job responding to it. Please, it drifts up in front of my screen here.
If someone does have a question, if you can please just raise your hand. I didn't see any question in the chat at this moment.
Okay, I will continue.
Okay.
We see slightly different, but in some ways similar prices for the 5-minute market. Again, a very substantial impact from internal congestion outside of California in PNM, and the transfer congestion in SRP, for example. This again is a chart I don't typically include in the deck because it's a little bit messy, but I think it does a good job of highlighting the increase in internal congestion. This is not including congestion on transfer constraints. It's just showing the impact on aggregated load points in each of the DLAPs, each of the major load areas within CAISO, or in each of the balancing areas outside of the CAISO. So showing average values by quarter for each area, and you can see that starting in Q2, but really Q2, Q3, and Q4, we have a wider impact of that internal congestion. Here I'll highlight particularly, I think I can, will it do this for me? It will not. I'll highlight particularly the PNM that we saw on the earlier screens. You can see on this slide. This table is a table we've been putting into our reports for quite some time. So if you'd like to do a comparison to previous periods, you can. Shows the average WEIM transfer constraint congestion in the 15-minute market by frequency and by price impact. We count a constraint as being congested, whether it's congested in the import or export direction. The 15-minute market is on the left 2 columns. The 5-minute market is on the right 2 columns. Start at the bottom. This is rank ordered by the frequency of congestion, and you can see here that PowerX, labeled as BC Hydro, and the earlier transfer charts was congested in the 15-minute market, a little over half, and a little over 50% of intervals, and in the 5-minute market in almost 3/4 of intervals. That is associated with a lower price in that area, so lower by about $11 in both markets. Salt River Project, which had one of the lowest prices on average for the quarter, was separated by congestion about 27% of the time, 26% in the 5-minute market, and that lowered their prices in those times by about over $30. Very substantial impact. One of the reasons we look at consistently have started looking at midday hours separately from net load peak hours is because we see consistently different prices and transfer and congestion patterns in those hours. That is due to the high level of solar generation within the California ISO, but also in other areas. The red dashed line here is showing the average net load. So that's load minus utility scale wind and solar compared to the average hourly prices. Those again are shown in blue for day ahead, yellow for 15-minute, green is the 5-minute price. So again, a fairly high correlation. What's unusual for this quarter compared to the last couple of years is not the high correlation, which we're getting used to, but the fairly high prices during the midday period. It is not unusual to see very low prices in that period, and it is typical to see that relatively low-priced renewable generation being exported. One of the things I think is interesting, and again, I was taking advantage of our extra time today, but I'm going to speed up just a little bit. Extra time today to highlight the convergence bidding. So again, this is the financial bids that are able to be paid the difference as supply between the day-ahead market and the 15-minute market, or to pay the difference as demand for the day-ahead to 15-minute market. We've seen a pretty substantial increase in convergence bidding revenue across this period, with particularly high values in December. Another pattern I want to highlight, and I think this explains a lot of the difference between the 15-minute market price and the 5-minute market price, which you can see in the averages and almost particularly in net load peak hours. And I'll just go back here. The net load peak hours, if you look at our 18 or 19 there's a substantial gap between the 15-minute market price in yellow and the 5-minute price in green. Convergence bidding, virtual bidding, is able to arbitrage the difference between the day-ahead in blue and the 15-minute in yellow, but not able to arbitrage the difference between the yellow 15-minute and the green 5-minute price. The chart on the left is showing average hourly imbalance conformance, otherwise known as load conformance or load bias, shown in solid lines for 2022 in average and in dotted lines for 2021. These operator adjustments to load, so increases in demand, have been steadily rising since 2017, but were particularly high in the Q4. So we're seeing up at about 2 additional gigawatts of demand being added in the 15-minute market, with something on the order of 300 megawatts in the 5-minute market. Additional demand, is you would expect, is associated with higher prices, which we see in those hours. The chart on the right is showing the distribution of that 15-minute market imbalance conformance. So the box whiskers, so the within 1 standard deviation is shown in the box, with the more extreme values being shown outside of that. We did not include any charts on FRP, flexible ramping capacity, in the report, partially because the flexible ramping product has been consistently priced at 0, not in every interval, but in over 99% of intervals. The big news here is that the ISO implemented in February a new model of procurement for flexible ramping product, and we are evaluating that. The nodal procurement that was implemented in February reduces procurement of capacity from resources that are not able to meet system uncertainty particularly because of congestion. So for example, a resource that is separated by congestion, say in the Northwest, would, in the model that we had in Q4, be able to supply flexible ramping product, and the model that is currently in place in the market as of February 2023 would not be able to do that if that particular constraint is being considered. We're doing a lot of work right now, and I will highlight a couple areas in which we're doing a lot of analysis of the new FRP. One, we'll do a report on the nodal procurement, and separately, we're going to do some reporting on the quantile regression of uncertainty. The ISO has a new model of uncertainty that's being used in the flexible ramping product. It is also being added to the flexible ramping resource sufficiency evaluation in the WEIM. I'll just end by saying on FRP that overall, we find that operator uncertainty is highly over the load, and the future availability of resources, especially ramping resources, is driving a lot of the load conformance that we see in CAISO, which is systematically different from most of the rest of the WEIM. I hear there are a couple questions. Stop for those.
Yes, we do have a question from Sybil and then Chris. So Sybil, go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, this is a question back on slide 19 around the congestion on the transfer constraints. in the prior slides, you had mentioned that you're starting to look at the internal congestion as well. And I was curious if this congestion frequency here is incorporating when internal congestion is occurring as well, or if this is purely on the transfer constraints.
This is purely on the transfer constraint. This slide is purely internal. This one is purely transfer constraint.
Okay,
there are tables, though, in the quarterly report that show the similar frequencies and impact for the internal constraints. It is such a large table. The font size is unfortunately small and wasn't conducive to the presentation.
Okay. It's really helpful that you're starting to separate these out a bit more for the non-CAISO areas, just because this is pretty important for thinking about how this is going to apply in the EDAM design. So appreciate that you're moving in this direction with the reporting. Thanks for the clarification there.
Sure. I'll say we have always separated them out. What's really happened here, and I think it's interesting, is that there was very little internal congestion outside of CAISO in the WEIM. And we are starting to see a lot more of that in this quarter, and that's why we've highlighted it.
Thanks for clarifying that. And
sure.
It's good to know that the charts will have, when previously they said that it was just the CAISO internal, I get that you're saying that was because that was what was primarily driving it, but just being a little more precise with separating those out and what it's truly referencing there is really helpful for folks who are trying to understand this better. So thanks.
Yeah. To make sure I didn't misspeak at all, because they were all internal CAISO constraints, it was only CAISO internal congestion. Is there a question from Chris?
Yeah. Hi, Amelia. It's Chris Dunn with Customized Energy Solutions again. Real quick, actually back on slide 18 on the internal congestion piece of that I had a question about. It just seems like over Q2, starting in Q2, it seems like there's a pretty big increase in those internal congestion in those EIM areas. Do you have any further thoughts about the drivers behind that? I guess this is the price separation, but that would just indicate that there's more congestion occurring as well. So, which kind of tracks, I think, with everything that's shown on this slide. But I was just curious if you had more thoughts about the actual drivers, because it seems to be a pretty significant change from looking at Q1 back into 2021 as well.
It really was. I'll concentrate on the Q4 here, but what we see are constraints that were not binding at all earlier that were in fact binding. So particularly in this case, a set of constraints associated with Four Corners had a significant impact across the WEIM, including within the CAISO. And there were other internal constraints as well.
Thank you.
Sure. I'll end sort of talking about the uncertainty, quantile regression of uncertainty that has been implemented in February. I really encourage market participants to do their own evaluation. Really looking forward to hearing from people. If they feel that this is reflecting uncertainty in their area well or not. It's a sophisticated model, it's a complicated model, and we are doing, I think, what we can do in the Q1 report to sort of highlight some of the impacts we're seeing with that. If you're more interested in that, the ISO did a lot of reporting on it in the NPPF presentation, which many of you I think probably joined. That is available there. Offset costs. Offset costs was $36 million in Q4, $416 million here in 2022. These are provisional numbers while we wait for the final settlement values to come in, so they are subject to change. That said, the $176 million in 2020 was a record high. 178 million in 2021 was a record high, and 416 million is a very high offset cost. So reminder, the offset costs are paid by measured demand, so that is load plus exports, and they account for the difference between what is paid to generation and what is paid by load. You can see the majority of the cost in Q4, but this is true historically, and it was true for for 2022 as well, is in the congestion offset cost. If you're interested in that, there is a really good write-up of the June congestion offset cost in our Q2 report. The simple way to explain the congestion offset cost is that it's often associated with modeling changes between the day-ahead and 15-minute market and between the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market. You can take as an example a case where the line is congested and the limit is changed by being lowered in the real-time market. And in that case, you could have flow in the same direction in a schedule that is decked but not increased, but no offsetting increase in schedule to offset that cost. We've done some deep dive into the energy imbalance offset cost, and we have found that much of this energy offset cost can be explained by the structural differences between the way that generation is paid and the way that load in the California ISO market pays. Just highlight the generation is paid incrementally, so the difference between your 15-minute market schedule and your day-ahead schedule in the real-time market is paid at the 15-minute market price, and the difference between the 5-minute and the 15 is paid at the 5-minute price. The difference between your eventual meter and the 5-minute, again, at the 5-minute price. That's the incremental settlement. The way that load pays, this is what I would call non-dispatchable load. So most load is paid based on the difference between the meter and the day-ahead schedule at an average hourly weighted price. There are two different calculations for the average hourly price, but the short version is that when the 15-minute and 5-minute prices are different, the average hourly payments by load will not equate to the payment to generation, and that results in offset costs. And one more note on the offset costs. We're doing some work comparing the difference between an incremental settlement of load, so if load were settled the way generation is settled, and the current settlement for load. And by doing that, we can calculate what we consider to be cost shifts from one party to another party. That's a working paper we're hoping to publish in the next I hope in the next couple weeks. Let's see. Okay. Ancillary service costs up about 10%, so that's much lower than our gas price increases. And those ancillary service bids are capped, but do reflect the opportunity cost of energy. As you can see here, the non-spin is almost nothing. Most of the costs are coming from regulation down, shown in blue in the Q4. Overall, there were higher regulation down requirements, but lower operating reserve, so spin and non-spin requirements. And we see a dramatic reduction compared to the previous quarter, slight increase compared to Q4 of 2021. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed up, but please do raise your hand if you have a question. Day-ahead congestion rent rose to $374 million in the fourth quarter, raising prices in the north, lowering prices in the south. That's about a $1 billion, which might be one of our highest congestion, day-ahead congestion rents annually. Kind of looking back, this is looking back at annual values for congestion revenue rights. We've seen those congestion revenue rights losses to ratepayers fall dramatically after the changes that went in 2019. So average losses of about $45 million a year. When we look at 2022, this is showing quarterly values. It's the same values, so auction revenues in blue, payments to auction CRRs in green, taking into account the Track 1A and Track 1B changes, and total ratepayer losses shown in yellow. Those spiked in Q2. For Q4, they were about $26 million, which, looking back at the congestion rent is about $374 million, so that's about 7% of day-ahead congestion rent. That's consistent with losses, annual losses in 2021 and 2019, about the same. They were a little higher in 2020 on average, more like what we saw in the Q2, but much higher before the changes went in place. So in 2018, before the changes went in place, losses to ratepayers were about 21% of day-ahead congestion rent. So high, but not once you take into account the increase in congestion. Won't spend too much time on this. There were changes in the WEIM RSE Phase 1 enhancements that were implemented earlier in 2022. Just wanted to highlight a couple things that we mentioned earlier. One, there were some changes to the modeling of batteries in these tests, and those, for the most part, have been fixed. The two values that have been fixed, one is the counting above maximum capacity, and some double, essentially not accounting correctly for ancillary services. A second component of that RSE Phase 1 enhancements has not yet been implemented, and that is the component that would reduce import and export awards counted in the test based on the transmission profiles at the T-40. Rather than capping at the transmission files at the T-40, our analysis is showing caps at values that are not associated with the T-40 values on the tags. One other note that I wanted to make is a pattern similar to the increase that we saw in the imbalance conformance load bias. We've seen a relative increase in the use of operator adjustments in the residual unit commitment requirement for the ISO. The requirement is shown by the gray line and is the sum of an adjustment for renewables that may not be bid into the day-ahead market, but that the market anticipates will appear in real time. Cleared net virtual supply. So again, those are the financial bids that won't be in there in the real time. And in blue, the difference between the day-ahead forecast of load and total day-ahead cleared capacity. Red shows operator adjustments, which are added on top, similar to the imbalance conformance. I need to go back through some of our statistics, but to calculate the exact values, but I think the Q4 is unusually high. There were concerns. There were some concerns about high gas prices, which again were across the Western EIM market footprint, as well as high demand and lower levels of import supply. And I believe this is my last slide. So there is some time left at the end for additional questions, but bid cost recovery. Bid cost recovery payments rose for December from about, for the CAISO alone, which is shown in the blue for day ahead, red for residual unit commitment, and green for real time. In December alone, those rose to about $53 million from comparing to December the year before, about 10. So that's more than a fourfold, 425% increase in cost for CAISO in December alone, much higher than the, well, higher than the PG&E Citygate increase, but in line with the SoCal Citygate price increase, which was about 427%. Most of the bid cost recovery payments are being made to gas resources. And this is a little bit of color that's not in the report. We've done some analysis of bid cost recovery payments in CAISO that we have published in the Fast Start pricing stakeholder process. So if you're interested in the determinants and the drivers for these bid cost recovery payments, I'd suggest looking there. As historically, when we see the relatively high percent of these that are going to gas resources, they tend to be going to the non-fast start gas resources. So they tend to be going to the resources that are higher cost resources, larger MSG resources, for example. We've also, across the year, seen a fairly dramatic increase in bid cost recovery payments to storage resources. And that was true in Q4 as well. I believe the total cost of bid cost recovery at $258 million is a historical high. I think it might be one of our highest values since MRTU in 2009. With about 9 minutes remaining, I'll stop and see if there are any additional questions on anything.
We do have a question. Caller, your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Alan Mack, SDG&E. Can you just give us a quick flavor for why the BCR payments were 4 times higher in December this year, year over year?
Yeah. For gas resources, the gas price, I think, explains most of that change. The bid cost recovery payments account for the difference between bid-in costs, both energy and commitment, and market payments on a daily basis, and that's calculated separately for the day ahead in the real time. So for gas resources, I think a lot of that is a similar mechanism, but paid at a higher price because the electricity prices were higher. Bids had to be higher also. And those marginal bids we saw for energy in the supply curves. The other thing that's going on is the increase in storage capacity. Storage resources do get paid bid cost recovery, similar to any other resource that's in the market. They tend to receive it for different reasons, and that tends to be because it's an energy buyback, rather than accounting for some sort of commitment cost that wasn't recovered in the market. So when exceptionally dispatched or otherwise, the market dispatched to buy back schedule uneconomically at something, or when the bid associated with that interval wouldn't necessitate that results in bid cost recovery payments.
Okay, so thank you, that's helpful. To the extent that those extra payments are going to gas units that reflect the higher cost of gas, obviously this past December, that makes sense. But what doesn't quite make sense to me is why the market prices wouldn't also jump to keep up with that. If you're seeing gas prices jump and BCR payments jump commensurately because the market prices aren't keeping up, does that suggest that there's something missing in the market clearing prices? Because I worry that these payments are being made as side payments to gas units where it should be captured in the market, and it seems like maybe units aren't being committed efficiently.
The ISO has 3-part bidding, as I know you know. So for a typical large gas resource, the drivers for the bid cost recovery are relatively more frequently the commitment costs. So in this case, and if I can ask for the forgiveness of going back through so many slides, I'll go back to our I like the supply curves here. So for a gas resource, if the energy bid is rising, so is the commitment cost. In the same instance that the clearing energy price, which was 50% of the time above 250, that energy price paid to the dispatched energy may not have been sufficient to cover the bid-in, startup, and minimum load costs. And that difference, I'd expect to move proportionally with the gas prices.
So if I'm hearing this right, it's primarily because the market is not properly compensating for the startup and min load costs, but that doesn't strike you as a concern because that's not really part of the marginal cost of clearing energy prices?
So we have a set of comments that is years, and probably 4 or 5 years old right now, on the efficiency of three-part pricing. This is a three-part tariff, and the marginal energy price is reflecting the marginal energy bids in the market. I don't. The CAISO market uses optimized dispatch commitment run that is based on the bid-in commitment cost. So I think we're seeing efficient commitment, and I think we're seeing efficient dispatch. But in that efficient solution, you can have particular resources that find that their commitment costs weren't wholly made up by the efficient energy price. So some level of bid cost recovery can be efficient. I'll use maybe the storage. There we go. Storage resource bid cost recovery as an example. So I think that was over something around $11 million for the quarter. So not small. And that again is based not on a different sort of unrecovered commitment costs in the market. That's based on market dispatches that are leading to uneconomic dispatch of storage resource. So I'll give you an example because I realize that sounds inefficient of what that can be. If a storage resource, for example, is constrained potentially by an exceptional dispatch or some other reason to a particular state of charge, and needs to achieve that particular state of charge, that may require the market to dispatch it differently than its generation bid. That's a case where it might be forced to buy back its schedule, and that can be the price associated with that is typically represented by the resource's bid.
Okay. I think I understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. If you are more interested in it, please send an email. I'll suggest if you're interested in asking questions about the reports, feel free to contact me, or there's a generic email address for the Department of Market Monitoring, which I'm encouraging people to use. That's dmm@caiso.com, and we're happy to take questions there. Both the analysis of CAISO BCR that went into our Fast Start pricing comments, and which we submitted back, I don't remember exactly when, in 2022, and then that sort of addressed the empirical, some of the empirical questions, and then comments that we submitted at FERC on the original NOPR, I think, addressed the theoretical questions of efficiency.
Hi, Amelia. This is Chris Devin with CES More Time. I was just curious about that report you had mentioned when you said fast start pricing. That was in the FERC proceeding on fast start pricing in that NOPR.
Chris, that should still be on our website. It's been long enough that it's probably in the archive. But
okay. Yeah, I couldn't find it. I'll look in the archive. That's fine. Thank you very much. I was just curious as to the storage concept, because we're getting more and more storage on the system. You're talking about that piece of this PCR. I mean, it sounds to me like these state of charge constraints and the way that the market is using storage and the challenges that have been happening with the day ahead and ancillary service state of charge constraints and how those things flow into the real-time market is maybe causing a lot of PCR, and I'm just curious as to, does DMM hope that CAISO will start to work on some of these changes for the state of charge constraint stuff a little bit sooner rather than later? Because it seems like CAISO has delayed that quite a bit and won't even start working on it until 2024, and then it's not going to be put in place until 2025 at the latest. I mean, at the earliest. Seems like a long time to be potentially causing a lot of these uplift costs. Do you have any thoughts on that? Should they be moving faster? Storage.
Last year, there was a change made to BCR for storage resources to account for a mechanism that could be easily subject to inflated BCR payments. That level of flexibility we expect to continue, and I hope to see continuing. If we see an instance in which the modeling constraints, or whether they're bid in by resources themselves or the market is enforcing them, but market enforced constraints are somehow leading to BCR in a way that would be potentially subject to manipulation. That's definitely something that we would discuss with the ISO, and I think as they have shown, they will take action on that.
Okay, well, it's good, comforting that you guys will be watching to see if that's going to have a lot of impacts on costs. But I guess on the other side of that, for the suppliers, I think it's a little bit concerning if, these resources aren't really going to be dispatched as economically or as efficiently as they could be. The pricing and some of these outcomes, because these constraints aren't reflected by the modeling of them. It's or the operations and modeling and market dispatch of the resources. I think that's concerning. So I would hope that CAISO would pick this stuff up sooner rather than later, but that's a question more for them. So anyhow, thank you for your thoughts. I appreciate the time.
Sure. They did extend the minimum state of charge through, I believe, the end of September at the board meeting last week.
Yeah, I mean, I think that policy seems to be pretty inefficient too, and just doesn't address the concerns, because well, we could get into more of a discussion on that offline. Anyhow, I appreciate the thought on the MSOC constraint, but I think that doesn't really address some of the issues with the other types of state of charge issues and operational issues with storage that need to be addressed with these EDs and other type of things, maybe like a totally new model for storage or something like that. But anyhow, I'll just have a chat with you offline on some more details on that stuff.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any other questions? I think we are a couple minutes over. If not,
nope, no questions in the queue.
Well, thanks, Michelle, and thanks everybody for tuning in on what is spring break for many of you, and appreciate your time. And we'll talk to all of you in a few months when we publish the next report. In the meantime, please do not hesitate to ask questions via email, either directly to me or to dmm@kaiso.com. Thanks very much.